Hello YouTube and welcome to my third video of the Legacy project, and this is a part of the self-destruction filter series. Now the reason I'm kind of talking about the filter series first and the self-destruction is this is actually my first time actually doing a YouTube channel, and at the same time I'm also just learning as well about the ropes of using different types of video suites, things of that nature. And the reason why we're going to talk about these filters is because they're well known and most of you know about the dangers, but the bad part is I don't think that many people understand the gravity of the situation. So the first filter we're going to talk about is the nuclear war. And the reason why I need to talk about this is because we are closer than we've ever been to a nuclear exchange than we were during the Cold War. And we need to talk about that. And the reason why this is important is because we've never been like this, not since 1980, not since the 1980s and the 1960s. And the thing is, we've come very close. And one time we actually came so close to a mad exchange, there were 70,000 warheads in play. And then also at the same time, even after the Soviet Union broke up, we also found out that in 1995, that Boris Yeltsin had actually had the Che-Get, which is known as the Soviet football, in front of him, and he had it open, believe it or not. And it was all in response to a Norwegian atmospheric test. And this seems to be a common thing here, is that we get so darn close to it, because in 1983, if it wasn't for Stanley Petrov, then we could have ended up in a situation where 70,000 nuclear warheads were exchanged. And it was all because he decided not to trust the computer data, but trusted his instincts and decided to have them check it again. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is because we have 3,500 nuclear weapons that are actually deployed right now. The Russians have about 1,600. We have about 1,700 out on nuclear submarines, silos, all sorts of different things. And we also happen to have 15,000 plus nuclear weapons in the world. And all I can say is that is nothing short of insanity. Now, we need to talk about the exchange sequence. Now, when a nuclear weapon is actually lifted off, now this is also before we had the Sarmat, before we had the Oreshnik, before we had the Birevestnik, or the Poseidon torpedo, the President of the United States had 30 minutes. And the first 15 minutes was spent trying to identify whether or not there was an attack in progress. And then the President of the United States had 6 minutes. And what he would do is open the briefcase that is carried around by his aide, and inside is something that looks like a Denny's menu. And he then basically looks through all the options and then decides what he is going to do. Pardon me. So once he is done with that and have decided what to do, nuclear weapons happen to be a use it or lose it for the most of the times, and they will begin with strategic targets. But first, there is a chance they will use it as an electromagnetic pulse, which is where they will then blow a nuclear weapon in the upper stratosphere, which is about 300 miles above Kansas, especially if you want to get the continental United States. And if that be the case, then you could be losing your entire communications, you could be losing your power lines, you could be losing things like this, as a matter of fact. So the next thing you know, you no longer have internet, you may not have power to your home, and you probably don't have radios or any other forms of communication, and anything with small transistors is possibly fried. And there is a good possibility that the computers that are inside of your vehicles are also fried. So that also means to put it back into operations. Now, this is not a simple case of things get turned off and then they come back on a little bit later. No, no, no. This is where entire power stations are destroyed. There's a possibility that there will be flaming homes because of different things that are plugged in will catch fire. There's always a possibility of that. So once those things happen, once those nuclear weapons start to land, they have two types of bursts. They have surface and they have aerial. And now we also happen to have the Poseidon torpedo in play, which then uses a radioactive tsunami to wipe out entire coastlines. And if you also know what the status 6 is, then there is a good chance that the evidence points that the Poseidon torpedo is salted. That is when cobalt-59 is wrapped around the core, it becomes cobalt-60, and when it's spread out over an area, it irradiates, it breaks down into nickel-60, and it could be there for 120 plus years, radiating everything with lethal radiation. In other words, that land becomes unusable. Then we also happen to have when the nuclear weapon goes off, if they are using it on surface targets, which could be the silos in, say, Nebraska or some areas like Wyoming, And the next thing you know, if you've ever seen the FEMA map, you'll notice that there happens to be fallout radiation will start landing, and it's going to be very lethal for the first 48 hours. And most of the time, that fallout will follow the jet stream and other weather patterns. After the fallout is landed and once the initial exchange is over, then there is a possibility that we will have what's called nuclear winter. Nuclear winter is a case where the ash and smoke and the dirt and chemicals are all thrown up into the stratosphere into a place where it cannot be rained out. It spreads out over the entire Earth's atmosphere. And then there's a possibility it will cool down the Earth. In some cases, it could be anywhere between 12 and 20 degrees centigrade in some places. They speculate that within a year, there will be about 90% of the population of the Northern Hemisphere will be gone. And after 5 years, it will be 99% of the population in the Northern Hemisphere will be gone. They speculate that the only government that will probably be around will probably be New Zealand. So I got to ask you something. Now, I know some of you say, well, that's a big difference from 70,000 warheads, and yes, the nuclear weapons that they have today are a little bit smaller and more strategically designed, but the fact remains that that's 3,500, and the average nuclear warhead is close to 100 to 150 kilotons. So in other words, that's close to 3,500 gigatons on standby, and if all of them are used at once, there's a good possibility they could put the planet into a nuclear autumn for about 5 years. Now, some of you say, well, what has that got to do with infrastructure or anything like that? Doesn't that mean I could just survive after the nuclear blast? Not so. Here's why. Because once the nuclear winter sets in and it starts to go down, the temperatures start to drop, you all of a sudden will notice that there are no crops. And then the infrastructure is also disrupted, which means the crops are not getting from the field, are not growing in the fields. They're not being put on trucks or on rail cars. There are boats. They are not going to grocery stores. They are not going to places where they are needed. And you will also have a problem with chemicals, and you will have also a problem with different types of radioactive materials that are now starting to work their way into the food. Strontium-90 happens to mimic calcium, and cesium-137 mimics potassium. In other words, you'll be irradiating yourself if you eat contaminated foods that have these materials pulled inside of them, namely plants and animals that you find outside. So you'll be irradiating yourselves. And that is going to be dangerous because that could cause leukemia, that could cause all sorts of other funky diseases, and most likely, in most cases, a very early death. And at the same time, when we're talking about chemicals, they will leach into the different types of watersheds. They will also find their way into the air, and it will basically, the air will smell and taste kind of metallic-y because those different chemicals are working their way out of the system. Precipitation will drop close to about 45%. And so there's a good possibility that your small streams and rivers will freeze over. Getting fresh water will be nearly impossible for some places unless you are willing to do some distillation or even do some centrifugal work to actually isolate that water and purify it, even though it will still taste terrible. You've heard the mission. If you believe in this great work, subscribe to join the Legacy Project. Like this video to help the signal cut through the noise. Share it with others who need to hear this truth, and comment with your own analysis. Stand by for more transmissions.